They were young, in love, and armed to the teeth. To some, they were modern-day Robin Hoods. To others, cold-blooded killers on a crime spree that left a trail of bodies across the American South. But who were Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow really? Desperate criminals, media-made outlaws, or something far more complex? In this episode, we dive deep into the real story behind America's most infamous criminal couple, from poverty and prison cells to gunfights and getaway cars, and the bloody ambush that brought it all to an end. This is the true story of Bonnie and Clyde. Before the gunfire, the robberies, and the headlines that would immortalize her name, Bonnie Parker was just a girl from Texas. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born in 1910 in the small town of Rowena, the second of 3 children. Her father, Charles, worked as a bricklayer. But tragedy struck early. When Bonnie was just 4 years old, he died, leaving her mother, Emma, a widow. With 3 children to raise, Emma packed up and moved the family to Cement City, a gritty industrial suburb of West Dallas. She found work as a seamstress, scraping by the best she could. Even in poverty, Bonnie stood out. She was a bright, expressive child who loved the stage and dreamed of becoming an actress. She craved attention, the spotlight, something bigger than the life she'd been handed. By high school, she found herself drawn to a classmate named Roy Thornton. Their romance burned hot and fast. On September 25th, 1926, just 6 days before Bonnie's 16th birthday, they dropped out of school and got married. But it didn't take long for the dream to fall apart. Roy was no steady husband. He vanished for long stretches and couldn't seem to stay out of trouble with the law. The marriage crumbled. Though they never divorced, the last time they saw each other was in January of 1929. Still, when Bonnie died years later, she was wearing the wedding ring he had given her. Thornton, meanwhile, continued his spiral into crime. In 1933, he was sentenced to 5 years for robbery. A string of escape attempts followed, and on October 3, 1937, he was gunned down while trying to break out of Huntsville State Prison. When he heard about Bonnie's death, Thornton didn't mourn. He simply said, "I'm glad they jumped out like they did. It's much better than being caught." After leaving Thornton, Bonnie returned home to her mother's house and took work as a Dallas waitress. The job paid little, but it was steady, and it brought her into contact with a man named Ted Hinton, a local postal worker and regular customer. In a grim twist of fate, just a few years later, Hinton would become a deputy with the Dallas County Sheriff's Department and a member of the posse that brought Bonnie and Clyde's story to a bloody end. In early 1929, at just 18, Bonnie kept a diary. Her entries revealed a restless heart. She wrote of her loneliness, her dissatisfaction with life in Dallas, and her growing love of photography. But perhaps the most revealing glimpse into her soul came later, through her poetry. In pieces like The Story of Suicide Sal and The Trail's End, better known as The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, Bonnie painted herself as a doomed outlaw, destined to burn fast and die young. And that's exactly what she did, long before he became public enemy number 1. Clyde Barrow was just a poor boy from rural Texas, hardened by poverty and prison and fueled by vengeance. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born in 1909 in the small farming town of Tellico, Texas, the 5th of 7 children in a struggling family. His parents, Henry and Cumie Barrow, worked the land just to survive. But like many families in the early 20th century, the Barrows were eventually driven off the farm and into the city, chasing opportunity that never came. They landed in West Dallas in the early 1920s, a place less like a neighborhood and more like a wasteland of desperation. Too poor to afford rent, the Barrow family lived under a wagon until they scraped together enough money to buy a tent. It was survival, nothing more. By the age of 17, Clyde had already crossed the line into crime. His first arrest came in late 1926 after he panicked and ran from police over a rental car he hadn't returned. His second arrest followed soon after, this time with his brother Buck, for stealing turkeys. Petty crimes turned habitual. Though Clyde held a few honest jobs between 1927 and 1929, he also cracked safes, stole cars, and held up small stores. He was already living like an outlaw when fate introduced him to Bonnie Parker in January of 1930. The two clicked immediately. 19-year-old Bonnie was drawn to Clyde's intensity, and the two spent nearly every day together in the weeks that followed. But their honeymoon didn't last. Clyde was arrested soon after by Dallas County deputies for auto theft, but Bonnie wasn't ready to let him go. In March 1930, she smuggled a gun into the McLennan County Jail in Waco, and Clyde used it to escape. He didn't get far. He was captured just a week later. That arrest would change the course of Clyde's life, and the lives of everyone he would come to cross. In April, he was shipped off to Huntsville State Prison, and then transferred to the brutal Eastern Prison Farm. There, at just 21 years old, Clyde was repeatedly sexually assaulted by another inmate. Eventually, he snapped. Using a length of pipe, he crushed the man's skull. It was his first murder, and another prisoner, already serving a life sentence, took the blame. But prison didn't just turn Clyde into a killer. It broke something inside him. In a desperate bid to avoid hard labor in the fields, Clyde had 2 of his own toes amputated in January 1932. Whether it was self-inflicted or done by a fellow inmate remains unclear. What is clear is that he limped for the rest of his short life. Ironically, just 6 days after the operation, his mother's petition for early release was granted. Clyde was paroled on February 2, 1932, but the man who walked out of Eastham wasn't the same boy who'd gone in. According to his sister Marie, something awful sure must have happened to him in prison because he wasn't the same person when he got out. Fellow inmate Ralph Fultz was more direct. He said he watched Clyde change from a schoolboy to a rattlesnake. Clyde Barrow came out of prison with a mission, not for money, not for infamy, but for revenge. According to those who knew him, his true goal wasn't robbing banks. It was striking back at the Texas prison system that had chewed him up and spat him out. He and the Barrow gang hit small targets more than banks. Grocery stores, gas stations, anywhere they could find quick cash. But they were armed for war. Clyde's weapon of choice was the Browning automatic rifle, the M1918 bar, a military-grade weapon that made shootouts with police feel like battles. And for Clyde, every bullet fired was personal. Every legend has a beginning, and for Bonnie and Clyde, it started with a knock at the door and a cup of hot chocolate. The year was 1930, West Dallas. Bonnie Parker was 19 and out of work, crashing at a friend's house while helping her recover from a broken arm. Life was small and slow, far from the danger and chaos that would soon consume her. Then, one afternoon, Clyde Barrow walked through the door. He'd stopped by the house of Clarence Clay, a mutual friend, and found Bonnie in the kitchen, making hot chocolate. Clyde was 20, already neck-deep in a life of crime. But in that moment, he wasn't an outlaw, just a charming stranger with a confident smile and a dangerous glint in his eye. There are different versions of how they first met. Some are clouded by myth, but the most credible account places their introduction on January 5, 1930, at 105 Herbert Street in West Dallas, a modest home that would unknowingly become the setting for one of the most infamous partnerships in American history. From the moment they met, something clicked. Their connection was instant, electric. Neither of them could have known it then, but that meeting would spark a fire that would burn across state lines, leaving behind a trail of bullet holes, broken laws, and blood-soaked headlines. By 1932, Clyde Barrow wasn't just a criminal. He was a man on a mission, and he was building an army to carry it out. Fresh out of Eastern Prison in February, Clyde wasted no time. He teamed up with fellow ex-con Ralph Fultz and hit the ground running, robbing stores and gas stations across Texas. But this wasn't just about money. Clyde wanted revenge. Every dollar and every bullet was part of a bigger plan. A full-scale assault on Eastham, the prison farm that had turned him into a killer. That spring, Bonnie got swept up in the violence. On April 19th, she and Foltz were caught breaking into a hardware store in Kaufman, Texas. Their target, firearms. The heist failed, and both were arrested. Foltz was convicted and sent away. He'd never rejoin the gang. Bonnie, meanwhile, sat in the Kaufman County Jail for weeks, waiting. The grand jury never indicted her, and eventually she walked free. During her time behind bars, she passed the hours writing poetry, verses that hinted at a life spinning out of control. Within weeks of her release, she was back at Clyde's side, and the bodies started piling up. On April 30th, Clyde acted as the getaway driver during a robbery in Hillsborough. Inside the store, shots rang out. The owner, J.N. Bucker, was killed. Clyde never stepped foot inside, but Bucher's wife later identified him from photographs as one of the shooters. It didn't matter if he pulled the trigger. Blood was on his hands. By August 5th, Clyde and his crew were emboldened and reckless. He, Raymond Hamilton, and Ross Dyer were drinking moonshine at a country dance in Stringtown, Oklahoma when lawmen approached their car. It should have been a routine check. Instead, Clyde and Hamilton opened fire. Deputy Eugene Moore was killed instantly. Sheriff C.G. Maxwell was left clinging to life. It was the first time the gang had killed a law officer. It wouldn't be the last. On October 11th, they were suspected of killing a man named Howard Hall during a robbery in Sherman, Texas. Though the evidence remains murky, but there was no ambiguity in what came next. On Christmas Eve, 16-year-old W.D. Jones, a longtime friend of the Barrow family, joined Bonnie and Clyde. The three of them hit the road that night. By Christmas morning, they were hunting for their next getaway car. They found it, and its owner, Doyle Johnson, in Temple, Texas. Johnson, a young husband and father, was gunned down in cold blood as they stole his car. Less than 2 weeks later, on January 6, 1933, Clyde killed again. He, Bonnie, and W.D. Jones accidentally walked into a police ambush intended for someone else. It was in Tarrant County, and Deputy Malcolm Davis was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Clyde opened fire. Davis never had a chance. By the start of 1933, the Barrow gang had already murdered 5 people, and the spree was just beginning. On March 22, 1933, Clyde's older brother, Buck Barrow, was granted a full pardon and released from prison. He and his wife, Blanche, soon joined Clyde, Bonnie, and W.D. Jones at a temporary hideout located at 3347.5 Oak Ridge Drive in Joplin, Missouri. According to family members, Buck and Blanche intended their visit to be temporary. They reportedly tried to convince Clyde to turn himself in to authorities. Instead, the group settled into a daily routine that drew unwanted attention. Neighbors noticed loud behavior coming from the garage apartment. Alcohol-fueled card games that lasted into the early hours, frequent comings and goings, and gunfire. Clyde accidentally discharged a Browning automatic rifle while cleaning it inside the apartment. Though no neighbors approached the house, one reported their suspicions to local police. On April 13th, Joplin police sent a 5-man team in 2 vehicles to investigate. Believing they were confronting bootleggers, the officers approached the apartment with little preparation for what they were walking into. As soon as law enforcement arrived, Clyde, Buck, and W.D. Jones opened fire. Detective Harry L. McGinnis was killed on the spot, and Constable J.W. Harriman was fatally wounded during the gunfight. Bonnie Parker fired a Browning automatic rifle as the others retreated. Highway Patrol Sergeant G.B. Kaler took cover behind a large oak tree, where splinters from the .30 caliber bullets struck his face. In the chaos, Parker climbed into the car with Clyde, Buck, and Jones, while Blanche was pulled in from the street, where she had chased after her dog, Snowball. The shootout lasted only moments. The surviving officers later stated they had fired just 14 rounds. Of those, one bullet struck W.D. Jones in the side, another hit Clyde but was deflected by a coat button, and a third grazed Buck after bouncing off a wall. The gang escaped the shootout in Joplin, but the price was steep. They left behind nearly all their possessions: Buck's parole papers, issued only 3 weeks earlier, a full cache of weapons, one of Bonnie's handwritten poems, and a camera with several rolls of undeveloped film. The film was developed by the Joplin Globe. What came back were staged photographs of Bonnie, Clyde, and W.D. Jones, smiling, pointing guns, posing as outlaws. In one photo, Bonnie Parker clutched a pistol in one hand and a cigar in her teeth. The images were sent out over the newswire, and soon the Barrow gang was national news. The photo of Parker with the cigar quickly became iconic. In his book, Go Down Together, author Jeff Gwynne described the image's impact, writing that, unlike the suave John Dillinger or the romantically named Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde had something more provocative: the suggestion of young lovers on the run, armed and dangerous. Over the next 3 months, the gang ranged far beyond Texas. In May, they attempted to rob a bank in Lucerne, Indiana, and successfully robbed one in Okabena, Minnesota. They also began a disturbing pattern: kidnapping. In Ruston, Louisiana, they abducted Dillard Darby and Sophia Stone while stealing Darby's car. Like in several other instances between 1932 and 1934, they later released the hostages, unharmed, sometimes even giving them money for the journey home. While those stories occasionally softened public perception, the gang's violent reputation continued to grow. They were willing to shoot anyone, officers or civilians, who got in their way. Other gang members who took part in killings included Raymond Hamilton, W.D. Jones, Buck Barrow, and Henry Methvin. As the murder count climbed, so did the public's disillusionment. The glamour was fading. Blanche Barrow later described this period as desperate and volatile. With the gang's notoriety increasing, they found it harder to move undetected. Restaurants and motels became dangerous. They often cooked over campfires and bathed in cold streams. Living in close quarters, the 5 of them grew restless and argumentative. In late April, Jones stole a car from Dillard Darby, the same man they had previously kidnapped, and used it to split from the group. He wouldn't return until June 8th. 2 days later, on June 10th, Clyde was behind the wheel with Bonnie and Jones near Wellington, Texas, when he failed to notice signs warning of a bridge under construction. The car flipped into a ravine. Some sources claim a gasoline fire broke out. Others say acid from the battery spilled under the floorboards. Regardless, Bonnie suffered third-degree burns down her right leg. The damage was severe, the muscle contracted, her skin peeled away, and in places, bone was visible. Jones later recalled, "She'd been burned so bad, none of us thought she was going to live." Bonnie could no longer walk. She either hopped on one leg or had to be carried by Clyde. The group sought help from a local farm family, then kidnapped Collinsworth County Sheriff George Corey and City Marshal Paul Hardy to secure their escape, leaving both men handcuffed to a tree outside Eric, Oklahoma. The group regrouped with Buck and Blanche and took refuge in a tourist court near Fort Smith, Arkansas, where they attempted to care for Bonnie's wounds. But stability was short-lived. Buck and Jones botched a robbery, which ended in the murder of Town Marshal Henry D. Humphrey in Alma, Arkansas. The gang was forced to flee again, despite Parker's condition. In July 1933, the Barrow gang checked into the Red Crown Tourist Court, just south of Platte City, Missouri. The setup was modest: 2 brick cabins connected by garages, and the gang rented both. Directly to the south was the Red Crown Tavern, a well-frequented restaurant among Missouri Highway Patrol officers. Despite the high-risk location, the group made little effort to stay inconspicuous. Blanche registered the group as 3 guests, but the owner, Neil Hauser, saw 5 people exit the car. He also noted that the driver backed the vehicle into the garage, a maneuver he referred to as gangster style, meant to allow for a fast escape. Blanche raised further suspicion when she paid for the cabins entirely in coins. That same evening, she used coins again to buy 5 dinners and 5 beers. By the next day, Hauser's concern had grown. The gang had taped newspapers over the cabin windows, and Blanche returned for more meals, again paying with loose change. Her outfit, a pair of jodhpur riding breeches, was highly unusual for women in the area. Years later, witnesses could still recall the sight. Hauser alerted Captain William Baxter of the Missouri Highway Patrol, a regular customer at his restaurant. Meanwhile, Clyde and Jones had gone into town to purchase supplies for Bonnie's leg, crackers, cheese, bandages, and atropine sulfate. The pharmacist, suspicious of the request and the men's demeanor, contacted local law enforcement. Sheriff Holt Coffey had already received bulletins from authorities in Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas, warning him to be on the lookout for strangers requesting such medical items. He put the cabins under surveillance. Captain Baxter was notified and called in reinforcements from Kansas City, including an armored car. On the night of July 20th, 1933, Sheriff Coffey and a team of officers surrounded the cabins at 11 p.m., armed with Thompson submachine guns. A gunfight broke out almost immediately. The officers' .45 caliber Thompsons were outmatched by Clyde's Browning automatic rifle, a .30 caliber military-grade weapon he had stolen 2 weeks earlier from a National Guard armory in Enid, Oklahoma. In the chaos, a bullet struck the armored car and short-circuited the horn. Officers mistook the blaring noise for a ceasefire signal and hesitated. The gang used the confusion to flee. Law enforcement did not pursue the vehicle. The escape came at a heavy cost. Buck Barrow had been shot in the head. The bullet tore a large hole in the bone of his forehead and exposed part of his brain. Blanche had also been injured, nearly blinded by shards of flying glass. The gang was still on the run, but they were bleeding. Just 4 days after the shootout in Platte City, the Barrow gang found temporary shelter in a secluded spot, Dexfield Park, an abandoned amusement park near Dexter, Iowa. It was July 24, 1933, and Buck Barrow was still clinging to life. He drifted in and out of consciousness, able to speak and eat at times, but his massive head wound had left him critically weak. The blood loss was so severe that Clyde and W.D. Jones began digging a grave, expecting the worst. Local residents soon grew suspicious. They noticed the gang's makeshift bandages soaked in blood and alerted authorities. It didn't take long for police to confirm the campers were the infamous Barrow gang. Local officers, backed by nearly 100 armed spectators, surrounded the park. A gunfight erupted. Clyde, Bonnie, and Jones managed to escape on foot, vanishing into the Iowa countryside. But Buck wasn't so lucky. He was shot again, this time in the back. He and Blanche were captured at the scene. Buck was rushed to King's Daughters Hospital in Perry, Iowa. Despite surgery, he succumbed to his head injury and a bout of pneumonia 5 days later. Blanche, nearly blind from her injuries, would soon face prosecution and prison time. With Buck gone and Blanche in custody, the Barrow gang had shrunk. But it wasn't finished. Over the next 6 weeks, Clyde, Bonnie, and W.D. Jones continued their spree, ranging far beyond their usual territory. They traveled west to Colorado, north to Minnesota, and southeast into Mississippi, pulling off armed robberies to stay afloat. On August 20th, they hit an armory in Platteville, Illinois, stealing 3 more Browning automatic rifles, handguns, and a massive stockpile of ammunition. Clyde was rebuilding his war chest. By early September, the gang risked everything for a brief return to Dallas, a chance to see family for the first time in 4 months. Soon after, Jones split from the group and headed to Houston, where his mother had recently moved. He was arrested there without resistance on November 16th and transported back to Dallas. As autumn wore on, Clyde returned to robbing banks with local accomplices, while Parker's family worked to treat her ongoing injuries, wounds that had never fully healed. But the law was closing in. On November 22nd, Clyde and Bonnie arranged to meet family members near Sowers, Texas. Unbeknownst to them, Dallas Sheriff Smoot Schmid, along with deputies Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton, had set a trap. As Clyde approached the rendezvous point, he sensed something was off. He drove past the parked family car, just in time for the officers to leap up and open fire with machine guns and a bar. A bullet ripped through the vehicle, hitting both Clyde and Bonnie in the legs. Despite their injuries, the pair managed to flee once again, a narrow escape, but one that left them more vulnerable than ever. Less than a week later, on November 28th, a Dallas County grand jury formally indicted both Clyde and Bonnie for the January murder of Tarrant County Deputy Malcolm Davis, nearly 10 months after the killing. It was Bonnie's first official warrant for murder. The noose was tightening, and the end was finally drawing near. In the early weeks of 1934, Clyde Barrow launched his boldest attack yet on the Texas prison system, the very institution he blamed for the brutalization of himself and his fellow inmates. On January 16th, Barrow orchestrated the now infamous Eastern Breakout, freeing several prisoners, including close associates Raymond Hamilton and Henry Methvin. In the chaos, gang member Joe Palmer fatally shot Major Joe Croson, turning what had been a daring prison break into a blood-soaked vendetta. The murder of Croson had far-reaching consequences. As the officer lay dying, Texas prison chief Lee Simmons reportedly made a solemn promise. Every man involved in the breakout would be hunted down and killed. That vow shifted the Barrow gang from notorious criminals to public enemy number one. All but one of the escapees were eventually killed. Henry Methvin would preserve his own life by betraying the gang. To bring Clyde and Bonnie down, the Texas Department of Corrections enlisted retired Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, a living legend with a reputation as ruthless as the criminals he pursued. Hamer was tall, silent, and relentless, credited with over 50 kills and known throughout the state as the embodiment of Texas justice. Though officially retired, Hamer's Ranger commission remained valid, and he accepted a special assignment with the Texas Highway Patrol. His orders were simple: end the Barrow gang. Starting February 10, 1934, Hamer began tailing the outlaws, always just a step behind. From town to town, state to state, he tracked their movements, waiting for the right time to strike. As the manhunt intensified, the gang's actions only added fuel to the fire. On Easter Sunday, April 1st, near Grapevine, Texas, Clyde and Methvin, or possibly Bonnie, gunned down highway patrolmen H.D. Murphy and Edward Bryant Wheeler. Initial reports claimed Bonnie had fired the fatal shots, and one witness described her laughing as she stood over the fallen officers. Though that account would later be discredited, the damage was done. Bonnie Parker, once dismissed as Clyde's innocent tag-along, was now seen as a cold-blooded killer. Public sentiment turned swiftly and viciously. Newspapers sensationalized the story, printing lurid details and even running photos of Murphy's grieving fiancée in her would-be wedding dress at his funeral. Headlines screamed for blood. For the first time, a monetary reward was offered not for the capture, but for the dead bodies of Bonnie and Clyde. The pressure only escalated. Just 5 days later, Barrow and Methvin struck again, killing 60-year-old Constable Cal Campbell near Commerce, Oklahoma. They kidnapped the town's police chief, Percy Boyd, later releasing him unharmed, but not before Parker reportedly asked him to clear her name, insisting she didn't smoke cigars, a detail that had become emblematic of her villainous image. Boyd identified both Parker and Barrow. The resulting arrest warrant named them, along with John Doe, Methvin's identity still unknown. The newspapers doubled down. Editorial cartoons now featured empty electric chairs labelled "Reserved for Clyde and Bonnie." Whatever sympathy the public once held for the outlaws was gone. Now, Bonnie and Clyde weren't just on the run from justice, they were marked for death. By May of 1934, Clyde Barrow was a marked man. With 16 active warrants spread across 4 states, his time on the run was running out. Clyde wasn't just dodging local sheriffs anymore. he was being stalked by a hunter. A former Texas Ranger named Frank Hamer, a relentless lawman with a reputation for being as lethal as the men he hunted. Hamer had been watching the gang closely since February. He noticed a pattern. Bonnie and Clyde circled the edges of 5 Midwestern states, using state lines as a shield. Law enforcement couldn't legally cross jurisdictions, and the gang took full advantage of this loophole. But Hamer was smarter. He mapped Clyde's movements and predicted his next steps that would lead straight to Bienville Parish, Louisiana. There, in the dense brush of Highway 154, Hamer and a hand-picked posse of 6 men, Texas and Louisiana officers alike, waited in silence. They believed the pair would come to visit Henry Methvin's family, one of the gang's last remaining allies. It was a long wait. By May 23rd, the officers had been in position for over a day. Some were beginning to lose hope. But at 9:15 a.m., a familiar sound cut through the quiet. A Ford V8, Clyde's signature car. He slowed down, seeing a familiar truck parked on the roadside, the same truck Methvin's father had agreed to leave there as bait. Then the ambush erupted. 130 rounds were fired. Clyde was killed instantly, the first bullet striking him in the head. Bonnie screamed, but it was too late. She too was hit by a hail of bullets. 17 wounds on Clyde, 26 on Bonnie. Some shots struck their heads. One shattered Clyde's spine. They never stood a chance. When the shooting stopped, the scene turned chaotic. Locals swarmed the car. Some ripped pieces of Bonnie's dress. Others tried to cut off Clyde's ear and even his trigger finger, turning the crime scene into a gruesome sideshow. Officers struggled to regain control as souvenir hunters picked the car clean. The once feared outlaws were now trophies. Their bodies, still inside the riddled Ford, were towed to the Conger Furniture Store and Funeral Parlor in Arcadia, Louisiana, where curious onlookers flooded into town. Over 10,000 people by some estimates. Beer prices doubled, sandwiches sold out, and Bonnie and Clyde, in death, became the legend the newspapers had long warned about. One undertaker, H.D. Darby, came to identify the bodies. The irony? Bonnie and Clyde had once kidnapped him, and Bonnie had laughed when she found out he was an undertaker. "Maybe someday you'll work on me," she joked. She was right. Their story ended in a hail of gunfire on a dusty Louisiana road, but the legend of Bonnie and Clyde was only just beginning. In the aftermath of their deaths, thousands swarmed the scene, desperate for a piece of history, even if that meant pocketing shards of glass or cutting away blood-stained fabric. But behind the myth, behind the glamorized headlines and romanticized depictions, was a trail of destruction. Families shattered, officers gunned down, lives forever changed. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow weren't just star-crossed lovers on the run. They were outlaws, killers, and thieves, whose names became etched into American folklore. Nearly a century later, we're still fascinated by them. Maybe it's the photographs, the poetry, the rebellion. Maybe it's the way they died, together, violently, without warning. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because they were a symbol of a desperate time when the line between survival and sin was paper thin. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as captivating and chilling as we did, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. And let us know in the comments, do you think Bonnie and Clyde were victims of circumstance or cold-blooded criminals who got what was coming to them? Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, even legends bleed.